Welcome back to another Maidenary Design sewing tutorial. My name is Mary and I'm going to show you how to sew the Valencia top. This pattern comes with two different styles. I am wearing the Valencia top puff sleeve and the second style is a Valencia classic tee. In this video, I'll be showing you how to sew the puff sleeve top. The puff sleeve style combines both a knit and a woven fabric. So you will be needing stretch fabric or knit for the bodice and also for the sleeve lining. And then you will need a woven fabric for the puff sleeve. To find how much fabric you need for your size to sew this project, you can look in the listing at maidenmarydesigns.com, or you can find the fabric requirements in the instructions booklet for the Valencia pattern. I'd recommend finding your stretch fabric first for the bodice and then finding a complementary woven fabric that you would like to use for the sleeves. The knit fabric or stretch fabric needs to have a minimum stretch percentage of 60%. You can find the percentage of a fabric if you're shopping online in the product description, or if you are shopping for fabric in person or using a fabric that you already own, you can test the fabric stretch percentage by using the stretch percentage chart that is included in the sewing pattern booklet. Stretch the fabric until you begin to meet resistance, and whatever percentage it is at, that's the stretch percentage of your fabric. It needs to be at least 60% or higher to be able to use it for the Valencia top sewing pattern. The Valencia top is a mid-rise. It's a bit longer than the waistline, but shorter than a full length. And if you have a preference that you would like to shorten or lengthen the hem to be specific for your height, you can follow the lengthen and shorten instructions that are included in the pattern booklet. And lastly, be sure to pre-wash and dry your fabric before sewing to ensure for the best results. And let's get started with making the Valencia puff sleeve top.
Starting with the bodice, place the back shirt right side up, then place the front shirt on top of it with the right side down. Matching the right sides together, pin the shoulders together, then pin the side seams. Sew the shoulder seams and the side seams with a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you're using a standard sewing machine, first sew with a stretch stitch, either a zigzag stitch or a lightning bolt stitch with that 1 cm, 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then to finish the raw edge, we're going to sew that same seam a second time using a wider zigzag stitch. To see more information about the stitch settings, you can look in the instructions booklet for further details. Here I marked the seam allowance of 1 cm or 3/8 inch with chalk so that when my serger knife is cutting the seam allowance, I can maintain that measurement on all of my seams. With the serger, you only need to sew it once. It finishes the raw edge and allows that seam to have stretch. Press the seam allowances toward the back shirt using a heat setting that's appropriate for your fabric. And I would recommend using high steam. The steam helps to hold the press. Fold the neckband in half with the right sides together, matching the short ends. Pin together, then sew the short end with a 1 cm or 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you're using a zigzag stitch, there is no need to finish the raw edge on this. At the center of the seam allowance, snip the neckband about 6 mm or 1/4 of an inch. Be sure not to cut past the seam allowance. Then we're going to split them into opposite directions and iron it. Fold those pieces over one another to enclose the seam allowance and fold all the way around the neckband. Adjust the raw edges to make sure that the two sides meet each other at every point of the neckband. Next, we are going to quarter the neckband, meaning we are going to create 4 equal sections. Start by folding the neckband in half lengthwise with one end on the seam, and in the other end of the fold, place a pin. Then we're going to rotate the neckband, matching up the pins or the pin to the seam, then placing a pin in each of the two folds. Now you should have 4 pins evenly spacing your neckband into 4 quarters. Now we're going to attach the neckband to the neckline of the shirt. We're going to do this by matching the pins to the notches on the neckline. Here I'm matching the seam on the neckband to the center back notch. Pin them together and make sure that all 3 layers of fabric are aligned so that those raw edges all get sewn into the seam. Next, match the opposite pin to the center front notch and pin in place. Then pinch the center back and the center front notches and pull them until the length of the neckband matches the length of the neck opening. Pin the neckband to the neckline. The pin should be about 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch in front of the shoulder seam of the shirt. From here, you can start sewing. You only need 4 pins around the neckband. But if you would like some extra security to make sure it's all evenly spaced and that all 3 raw edges are aligned, here's the time to add in a few extra pins. Now we're going to sew a circle around the neckband using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you're using a serger, be sure to maintain that seam allowance. If you're using a standard sewing machine, you can use a stretch stitch first for the seam, then go around again, finishing the raw edges with a wider zigzag stitch. You can see here that I am pinching the fabric at the next pin, just barely stretching the neckband so that the neckband matches the length of the neckline. After sewing all the way around the neckline, run the serger off the edge of the fabric, leaving a long tail of that chain serger thread. Loosen the threads from one another and pull on them until those loops secure close to the raw edge of the fabric. Then, using the 4 threads, tie them into several knots to secure the end of the seam. This is how your finished neckband should look. Now we are going to press the neckband so that the seam allowance is going toward the main shirt away from the neckband. We'll press it first from the inside, then from the outside. I'd recommend using a high steam setting to make sure that that seam allowance holds in place and doesn't unfold or show from the outside while you're wearing the shirt. Moving on to the puff sleeve, sew a long gathering stitch along the top curve of the sleeve between the 2 notches and straight across the bottom of the sleeve. For your gathering stitches, use a straight stitch and lengthen it to the longest length setting on your machine. Starting with sewing the curve of the sleeve, start at the first side notch and sew 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric all the way across to the second notch. Do not backstitch at the beginning or the end of the gathering stitch, but instead leave long tails of thread that we will later use to gather the stitches of the sleeve. Then we're going to sew a second gathering stitch parallel to the first one. That's again 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the first stitch. Next, sew a long gathering stitch along the straight bottom edge of the puff sleeve. The stitch should be again 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the raw edge of the sleeve. Leave a long tail of thread, then sew a parallel gathering stitch 3 millimeters or 1/8 of an inch from the first stitch line. Again, leave a long tail of thread for gathering. Lay the sleeve lining right side up and place the puff sleeve on top with the wrong side up. Here you should have the right sides together, and we are going to gather the hem of the puff sleeve to match the width of the sleeve lining. Separate your bobbin thread from the top thread and gently pulling on the 2 bottom threads for the 2 stitch lines, move the fabric, gathering it along the threads very carefully not to break the thread But if a thread does break, you have that second gathering stitch as a lifeline and just carefully move the fabric along the stitches until these gathers bring the width of the fabric down to the width of the sleeve lining. Once they're matched up and your gathers are spaced out evenly, you can pin the lining to your puff sleeve hem. Serge or zigzag stitch the sleeve hem with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Sew with the gathers facing up so that you're able to adjust the positioning of the gathers as needed while you're sewing across the hem. If you sew this seam using a zigzag or lightning bolt stitch, you do not need to finish the raw edges because they will be fully enclosed within the sleeve after we attach it to the shirt. Unfold the sleeve and lay it flat with the right sides up. Fold the sleeve right sides together, aligning the side seams and pin in place. Pin the hem seam allowance toward the lining fabric. Then serge or zigzag stitch the side seam using a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. Press the seam allowance toward the double notches on the back of the sleeve. Turn the woven puff sleeve over the knit sleeve lining to enclose all of the seams. The right side of the woven fabric should be facing out, and the right side of the knit fabric should be facing the inside of the sleeve. Match up the seams of the two sleeve layers and pin them together. Then match up the center notches of the two sleeve layers and pin those together. Using the bobbin thread of the gathering stitches, gently pull on the tails of the bobbin threads, moving the woven fabric along the thread, creating gathers around the woven puff sleeve. Continue gathering until the two notches on the two layers of the sleeve match up to one another. There are no gathers at the underarm of the sleeve. So once those two are the same length, you can pin them together and move on to the next section. Adjust the gathers as needed so that they're even at the center notch of the sleeve, which will be at the top of the shoulder. Then repeat the same process on the opposite side of the sleeve, again by pulling on the bobbin threads and gently gathering the fabric along the thread until the woven sleeve matches the length of the sleeve lining. When the notches match up from the woven layer to the knit layer, pin the two layers together. The underarm of the sleeve should not have any gathers. This is how your puff sleeve should look. Next, we are going to sew a temporary basting stitch around the sleeve opening. Set your machine to a straight stitch with the longest stitch length setting. Place the sleeve under the presser foot with the gathering stitches facing up so you can adjust the gathers as needed while you're sewing. Sew around the armhole opening with a basting stitch 6 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. Now that the gathers are secured to the sleeve lining, we can set the sleeve into the shirt. Start by turning the main bodice of the shirt inside out, then match up the double notches on the back of the sleeve lining to the double notches on the back of the shirt. Match up the seam of the underarm on the sleeve to the shirt and pin together. Then match the front notches and the back notches of the sleeve to the shirt and pin those together. And last, match up the center notch of the sleeve to the shoulder seam and pin. Starting at the underarm seam, sew 5 short basting stitches. It will align those seams and keep them in place. Then we can sew all the way around the sleeve opening using a zigzag stitch or our serger with a 1 centimeter or 3/8 inch seam allowance. If you are using a zigzag stitch or lightning bolt stitch, you will want to go around it a second time with a wider zigzag stitch to finish the raw edges. Or with a serger, you will run the serger stitch off the end and tie off those loose threads. After finishing sewing the sleeve into the armhole, we can remove the temporary basting stitches from the gathering of the sleeve. Our final step is sewing the hem of the shirt. We're going to start by finishing the raw edge either on our serger or using a wide zigzag stitch over the raw edge of the fabric. For a serger, run the threads off the end of the fabric, then tie off the threads, closing in those loops to the raw edge and tie off with several knots. Lay your shirt flat with the right side out. Measure the hem of the shirt 2 centimeters or 3/4 of an inch, folded with the wrong sides together, pressing the hem with a heat setting appropriate for your fabric and using a high steam setting to hold the fold in place. Continue folding, measuring, pressing, and pinning the hem all the way around the hem of the shirt. Sew with a 1.5 centimeter or 5/8 inch seam allowance. Set your machine to a zigzag stitch with a 4 to 5 millimeter width and a 2.5 millimeter length. Here I'm using a walking foot, which is entirely optional, but my machine can be a little bit finicky sometimes with zigzag stitches, especially on knits. So I'm opting to use a walking foot. This is a good option if your machine also has trouble with wavy hems when sewing with knits. We're sewing the hem of the shirt with a zigzag stitch 1.5 centimeters or 5/8 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. Give the hem one last press, then it is complete. Beautifully done. Your Valencia top is ready to wear. I hope you enjoyed the process of sewing this garment and wear it for many years to come. If you'd like to tag Maiden Mary Designs and the hashtag Valencia Top on Instagram, I would be overjoyed to see your finished garment.